Hi, everybody. My name is Brendan Wadlin, and we are going to be doing a discussion slash presentation about the dwarf seahorse today, otherwise known as Hippocampus osterae. So you can see that little guy in the bottom left of the screen. That picture came from the NOAA website, and we're going to be touching on a couple of different topics related to these little guys, um, particularly with their mating and how they are actually an endangered species. We're going to go into why they may or may not, recover. Why are they endangered? Why is their mating so important? And a couple other interesting facts that we'll learn about along the way.
So we're going to do a quick introduction slash background on the dwarf seahorse. So a couple things I want to hit are some interesting facts. It's actually one of the smallest seahorse species in the world, between 16 to 38 millimeters in length, about 1 inch. Male species also have a unique brooding pouch, which, quote, ensures paternity of offspring. So you might be wondering what exactly that means. So it's just a little pouch, has like a small opening, allows them to hold on to their offspring. It's also the slowest moving fish, which I kind of thought was surprising because, one, it's the slowest moving fish, and also didn't know that seahorses were fish, so learn something new every day. They only move at about 5 feet per minute, according to the Guinness Book of World Records, and they do have a relatively short lifespan, only between 1 to 2 years. On average, it's about 1. And so, you might be wondering where you're going to find these little guys. So the Hippocampus osterae are found in the coastal Gulf of Mexico, Bahamas, Bermuda, Florida Keys, Florida's East Coast, Old Tampa Bay, Lemon Bay, Pensacola, and Texas. So basically, around the Caribbean. And most oftentimes you're going to find these dwarf seahorses in, shallow coastal areas, particularly when there's high salinity. So now we're going to talk about reproduction and breeding. So the picture on the right, see the two seahorses. Notice how they have their tails wrapped around each other. So that's kind of the first step of their courtship. And, basically they reproduce as they actually float from the benthic area of the water, so the bottom, and they kind of float all the way up as they kind of, as they mate. And so they do practice monogamy, which basically, if you don't know what that is, pretty much like marriage. So they have one partner and they kind of just stick with each other. And this is also reinforced by these daily rituals that they have where they kind of go out and basically, kind of play with each other, which I thought was pretty interesting. Males will produce between 3 to 16 offspring, and after about 10-day gestation period. And male dwarf seahorses carry 2 broods per month, and the mating season lasts from February to October. So now we're going to talk a little bit more about seahorses in general, the Hippocampus genus. So how do we identify seahorses? We see them, they have an upright posture, tells you almost right away that it's a seahorse. It's small, they're usually colorful, you can identify them pretty easily. Now, how did they grow into this seagrass habitat? So what we do know is that during the late Oligocene era, there were tectonic events that took place in the Indo-West Pacific that expanded the amount of shallow water areas and seagrass habitats. And the reason that's so important is because the seagrass habitat supports their upright posture, which allows them to be able to survive and allowed them to develop this camouflage which protrudes from their skin, like we talked about earlier on in their feeding techniques, and allows them to survive in that environment. So how did they evolve? Where did they come from? So what we do know from genetics is that they do come from pygmy pipe horses, syngithids, right? So we know that from genetics. Now, another question I wanted to pose was, seahorses are monogamous at some point in their life cycle. In other words, at some points in other seahorses' life cycles, not the dwarf seahorse, they're polygamous, which means they have multiple partners, right? So dwarf seahorses are monogamous because they have such a small spatial extent within their communities, more particularly with individuals. So once they find that one mate, they are very settled with that one mate, and they produce all their young throughout their 1 to 2 year life cycle with that other mate. And how do we know that? Well, there have been genetic tests done on dwarf seahorses in their own little community, which we could find that the dwarf seahorses, the offspring, would have alleles that matched up to exactly one father and exactly one mother. And that was a question that we couldn't figure out for a long time. But now, due to genetics, we were able to figure out, they are monogamous, and it's been proven. So in this Rose et al. Paper we looked at, 2014, that was the question. They knew a lot of other seahorses had been genetically proven to be socially monogamous at some point in their life cycle, and the question was, are dwarf seahorses monogamous? And can we prove this using genetics? So basically, what they did was they used 4 selected loci and a total of 16 pregnant male horses, with 8 collected in Florida and 8 sampled in Texas. They genotyped all of the offspring within each male's brood to determine the maternal contributions to each brood. So they found a maximum of 4 alleles per locus, segregating within each pregnant male's brood, which was consistent with each brood having exactly one mother and one father. And they were able to prove that dwarf seahorses were socially monogamous. So now we're going to get into a discussion about feeding techniques, foraging, how do dwarf seahorses feed. So dwarf seahorses do in fact consume mobile prey, live prey. They are not filter feeders. Although they are stationary, they do have to consume mobile prey. So one of the biggest weapons that they have at their disposal is their ability to use camouflage in order to ambush and surprise prey when they get too close. All they really have to do is just kind of bob their head forward a little bit, and they can just suck the prey basically right up through their snout. Now their diet consists of fish fry, amphipods, small crustaceans, and other small invertebrates. So basically anything that's small is going to be included in their diet. And the way they actually capture their prey is they intake the water through their snout, and the prey gets caught in the water. If they're small enough to fit in through their snout, then they're going to get in there, and that's basically how they capture their prey. Another thing that's also something to keep in mind is that they do not actually have any teeth. And another thing is that they actually have very simple digestive tracts, so they do have to constantly feed in order to maintain that nutrient level where they're going to be able to survive. So now we're just going to do a brief conclusion about the dwarf seahorse. So first thing I want to hit on is feeding techniques. Thought that was super interesting. Found out they didn't have teeth and that they actually intake water in order to consume their prey if they're small enough to fit into their snout. You can also see that they have little protruded pigments from their skin that allows them to have camouflage so that they can hide and surprise their prey. Other thing I wanted to talk about was the Rose et al. Paper, just real quick. Basically allowed us to, have evidence that seahorses are monogamous and that they only have one mate using genetics. I explained that earlier. Reproduction and breeding. That was pretty interesting. Between 4 to 16 offspring for the males, how they, again, are monogamous and have only one partner. And lastly, the interesting facts. Slowest moving fish in the world. Didn't know it was a fish when we started this, but now we all know that seahorses are fish. And so I just wanted to thank you guys for watching. Lastly, this is my works cited. So if you're interested in finding out where I got any of this information, you can just refer to this page right here. Everything that I said or referred to came from one of these three sources. Thanks again for watching, and I hope you enjoyed the video.